The agricultural moon of Bellwether turned slowly beneath a marbled sky of violet and gold, its atmosphere thickened just enough by the terraforming spires to hold real weather, real rain, real wind, real seasons that rolled across the farmland in long, unhurried waves. From orbit the moon looked like a quilt, green and amber patchwork stitched together by irrigation canals, dotted with the round silver roofs of grain silos and the low white domes of residential colonies. Meridian Hollow was one of the smaller colonies, tucked into a valley where 3 rivers met, and it was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business before breakfast. Extended families spanned entire streets. Grandmothers gossiped over fences that separated nothing at all. Children ran through the community orchard in packs, and on market mornings the smell of baking bread rolled down the lanes like a second sunrise. Evan Mercer had lived on the quiet side of that colony for 2 years, and in all that time he had never quite learned how to be a part of it. He wasn't unfriendly. He said good morning to the Whitfields when he passed their fence, complimented old Tobias on his tomatoes, and had once spent an entire Sunday fixing the Henderson's irrigation pump for nothing more than a thank you and a plate of cookies he'd eaten alone at his kitchen table. But friendliness, he had discovered, was not the same as belonging. Belonging required a kind of unhurried patience he had never developed, a willingness to sit on porches and let conversations wander nowhere in particular. Evan didn't sit on porches. Evan fixed things. He was an engineer by training and temperament both. The colony's de facto handyman for anything with a circuit board or a hydraulic seal, though his actual contract was with the terraforming authority, maintaining the atmospheric processors that kept Bellwether's air breathable, and its weather gentle. It was solitary work, mostly. Long hours in maintenance shafts and equipment sheds, diagnosing failures that no one else understood well enough to worry about. He liked it that way. Machines didn't require him to make small talk. Machines didn't notice when he forgot how to be around people for days at a stretch. He told himself he liked living alone. He had told himself that so many times it had started to sound almost true. His house sat at the end of a lane that dead-ended against the tree line, a small prefab unit with solar shingles and a porch he'd built himself out of reclaimed decking. It backed onto a stretch of communal garden allotments, most of them tended by families who came out in the cool of the evening to water their rows and talk over the low fences. Evan's own allotment, allocated to him when he moved in, had gone to seed within a month. He didn't have the knack for growing things. He didn't have the patience for it either. You couldn't fix a garden with a diagnostic scanner and a spare part. His nearest neighbor tended the allotment directly behind his. A long, orderly rectangle of carrots and greens and a small trellis of climbing beans, kept with a precision that put every other garden on the lane to shame. He knew her name because everyone in Meridian Hollow knew everyone's name. Liora Fenwick. She lived 2 doors down in a house the pale honey color of late summer wheat, with window boxes full of herbs and a porch swing that creaked in a way that had become, over 2 years, a kind of background music to his evenings. She was leporine. One of the long-eared, soft-furred people who made up a good portion of Bellwether's farming population, their communities having settled the agricultural moons 3 generations back for reasons that had something to do with an old affinity for cultivated land and growing seasons, though Evan had never asked for the full history. Liora had cream-colored fur with faint dapples of gray along her shoulders, long ears that swept back gracefully when she walked and stood bolt upright when she was startled, and a small, fluffy tail that was, Evan had noticed with some embarrassment the first time he clocked it, objectively adorable. She had a nose that twitched. Quick little flutters, almost too fast to see, that showed up whenever she was nervous, though it had taken him the better part of 2 years to learn to read that particular tell. She was, by any reasonable measure, beautiful. Evan had noticed this in the detached, cataloging way he noticed most things about the world, a fact filed away and left alone, because Evan Mercer did not do anything with facts like that. He was 34 years old and had precisely 2 romantic relationships in his adult life, both of which had ended with the other person telling him, in various kind and unkind ways, that he was hard to reach. He had accepted that assessment as accurate, and adjusted his expectations accordingly. Some people were built for closeness. He wasn't one of them. He made his peace with it somewhere around his 30th birthday, alone in an apartment 3 systems away, and he hadn't seen much reason to revisit the question since. So when he thought about Liora Fenwick at all, which was more often than he cared to admit, he thought about her the way a man might think about a well-tended garden he was allowed to look at through a fence. Something pleasant that belonged to someone else's life, not his. They spoke sometimes. Brief, easy exchanges over the fence line, about weather, about the ache of a long growing season, about whatever minor catastrophe had struck one of the colony's aging systems that week. She had a soft, quick way of talking, sentences that tumbled out warm and a little too fast when she was comfortable, and a laugh that startled him every time because it was so much bigger than her frame. He liked those conversations more than he let himself examine. He assumed, when he thought about it at all, that she was simply the kind of person who was warm to everyone. It fit what he understood of leporine culture, a farming people known across Bellwether for hospitality, for feeding neighbors and strangers alike as a matter of course. He'd eaten enough surplus zucchini pressed on him by enough different families over 2 years to believe it wholesale. He did not, in the autumn of his 2nd year in Meridian Hollow, believe that a woman like Liora Fenwick could be nervous around a man like him. It did not occur to him as a possibility worth entertaining. That was, in retrospect, his first mistake. What Evan did not know, what he would not learn until much later, and only in fragments, pieced together from Rosalind's loose tongue and old Tobias's knowing looks, was that he had been, in his own quiet way, a topic of considerable interest in Meridian Hollow long before the carrots ever appeared on his doormat. It wasn't unkind interest. The colony simply noticed things, the way small close communities always did, and what it had noticed about the man at the end of the lane was that he was polite and capable and almost entirely alone. He came to the harvest socials and left early. He fixed things for people and refused payment, and then disappeared back into his house before anyone could properly thank him over a shared meal. He had, in 2 years, never once been seen sitting on anyone's porch past dusk, never lingered at the market beyond what his errands required, never seemed to want anything from anyone beyond the transaction of a repaired pump or a diagnosed fault. Liora had watched him longer and more carefully than anyone, though she would have died before admitting it to a single living soul. She had watched him from her kitchen window on evenings when he came home late and ate standing at his counter, visible through his own uncurtained window, alone. She had watched him fix the Henderson's pump on a scorching afternoon, and refuse the lemonade they offered him twice before finally accepting a glass and drinking it too fast, as though he weren't sure how long he was allowed to stay. She had watched him say good morning to every neighbor on the lane and mean it, and watched him retreat into his house afterward like a man closing a door on something he wanted and didn't know how to ask for. She had told herself, for the better part of a year, that it was none of her business. She had a garden to tend and a cousin's wedding to help plan and a co-op stall to run on market mornings, and the quiet engineer at the end of the lane was not her responsibility, however much something in her chest ached, unbidden, every time she saw his kitchen light burning alone past 9 in the evening. It was her grandmother, visiting from the southern colonies for the autumn planting, who finally said the thing Liora had been carefully avoiding saying to herself. "You watch that boy the way your grandfather watched me," the old woman said one evening, over tea, with the particular bluntness that came standard with great age and great love. "Before he had the courage to bring me anything from his garden." Liora had gone very red and insisted, with more force than the moment required, that she did not watch Evan Mercer at all, and her grandmother had simply smiled into her teacup and said nothing further, which was, Liora would learn, her grandmother's most effective and most infuriating debating technique. But the seed, if the metaphor could be forgiven, in a colony built entirely on growing things, had been planted. Liora went to bed that night thinking about the old custom her grandmother had taught her as a girl, back before most of the colony's younger generation had let it fade into something their great-aunts still practiced, and nobody else quite remembered. She thought about it for 3 more days before she finally, almost without deciding to, pulled a bundle of carrots from her garden and tied them with twine and carried them, hard hammering absurdly hard for a woman crossing only 40 feet of shared lane, to the doormat of the quiet man at the end of the row. The bundle was waiting outside his door on a Tuesday morning, and Evan almost stepped on it. He'd come out early, thermos in hand, headed for a 6 a.m. shift diagnosing a pressure fault in the western atmospheric spire, and there it was, a neat bundle of carrots, greens still attached, tied with a length of garden twine and resting against the doormat like it had grown there overnight. A small card was tucked beneath the twine, the handwriting careful and looping. "You looked hungry, Elle." He stood on the porch for a long moment, thermos steaming in the cool morning air, staring at the carrots like they might explain themselves. He looked hungry? He turned the phrase over, trying to locate the memory that might have prompted it, some conversation, some moment where he'd said something about his freezer full of ration packs and his general inability to cook anything more ambitious than reheated stew. He came up empty. Which meant, he supposed, that she'd simply looked at him and drawn her own conclusions, the way people who paid attention to things sometimes did. He carried the bundle inside, set it on the counter, and found himself smiling at it in a way that made him feel faintly ridiculous. It was carrots. It was just carrots. He ate 2 of them raw, standing at his kitchen counter, before he left for his shift, and something about the crunch of them, sweet, garden fresh, nothing like the sad vegetables that came through the colony's supply drops, lodged itself somewhere in his chest and stayed there most of the day. That evening, he found Liora at the fence line between their allotments, kneeling in the dirt with a trowel, her ears tracking his approach before she turned. "Thank you for the carrots," he said. "You didn't have to do that." Her ears did something quick and complicated, a small twitch, half up, half sideways, and her nose fluttered. "Oh, it was nothing. I had extra. Always end up with more than I can use this time of year, and it felt silly to let them go to the compost when—" She stopped, seemed to catch herself mid-sentence, and shrugged with a little too much emphasis. "Leftovers. That's all. They were good," he said. "Really good. I ate half of them before I even got to work." Her whole face brightened at that in a way that made something in his chest do a small, unfamiliar flip. "Well, good. I'm glad." She turned back to her trowel, ears settling, and the conversation moved on to the weather forecast and a rumor about the Eastern Silos grain elevator breaking down again, and Evan went home thinking nothing more of it than that his neighbor was, as established, a kind person with a large garden. He did not think about the carrots again until the following evening, when he came home to find a covered dish waiting on his porch step. The dish was warm. That was the detail that stuck with him. Not the fact of it, but the warmth, which meant someone had carried it the short distance between their houses only minutes before he arrived, time to catch him fresh off his shift. He lifted the lid. Carrot soup, a rich burnt orange color, steam curling up into the cooling evening air, with a scatter of some dark green herb across the top that he couldn't identify and a slice of dense bread tucked beside the bowl. Another card, tucked under the bowl's handle this time. Needed to test a new recipe. You're my guinea pig. Sorry in advance if it's terrible. Elle. He carried it inside and ate it standing at the counter again, because that was simply how he ate most things, and it was, without question, the best meal he'd had in longer than he cared to calculate. It wasn't terrible. It was extraordinary, the kind of soup that made him understand, suddenly and viscerally, that everything he'd been eating for 2 years had been a pale imitation of food. He found Liora on her porch swing that evening, illuminated by the string lights she'd wound along the railing, a mending basket in her lap that she wasn't actually mending anything in. "The soup wasn't terrible," he said, leaning against the fence post. "It was the best thing I've eaten since I got to this colony." Her ears shot straight up, that particular tell he was starting to catalog without quite admitting to himself that he was cataloging it. And her foot, tucked beneath her on the swing, began a soft, rapid thump against the cushion. It was just a test batch. she said too quickly. I'm making it for the harvest social next week, and I wanted to get the seasoning right before I brought it to a big group. You were just convenient. Being right there. Convenient, he repeated, amused despite himself. Very convenient, she said, and her nose twitched twice in quick succession, and Evan found himself smiling at her in a way he didn't examine too closely before he said good night and went back to his own porch, where he sat for a while longer than usual, listening to the creak of her swing across the darkening lane. The bread came 2 days later, a whole golden loaf, still faintly warm, with a note that read, "Oven ran hot." Came out accidentally enormous. Didn't want it to go to waste. Evan looked at the loaf, which was, by any reasonable measure, a completely normal size for a loaf of bread, and found himself grinning at his own kitchen counter like a man losing an argument with himself that he hadn't consciously agreed to have. He was an engineer. He understood systems. He understood, in the abstract, that patterns which repeated with escalating frequency and diminishing plausibility were patterns worth examining rather than patterns worth simply enjoying. But some part of him, the part that had spent 2 years eating alone, the part that had made peace with being hard to reach, was not yet willing to let the pattern mean what it was starting, faintly, unmistakably, to mean. He told himself it was leporine hospitality. He told himself Liora was simply a generous person with an overactive garden and a habit of overshooting her portions. The roasted vegetables appeared the following week, still steaming under their cloth, with a note claiming they were extra from the co-op delivery, would have spoiled otherwise. An excuse Evan found himself examining with new and specific attention, because he happened to know, from 2 years of fixing the co-op's ancient refrigeration unit, that their delivery schedule ran on Thursdays, and this was a Monday. He didn't say anything about the discrepancy. He ate the vegetables, which were, like everything before them, extraordinary, caramelized at the edges, tossed in something bright and herbal he couldn't name, and he found himself, for the first time, deliberately watching Liora across the fence the following morning instead of simply enjoying whatever she offered him without examination. She was different around him lately, he was beginning to notice, in small ways he hadn't had cause to catalogue before. She talked faster when he thanked her for something. She found reasons to be in her garden at exactly the hours he tended to come home. Once, catching him watching her through his own kitchen window, she had ducked out of sight so quickly she'd nearly upended a watering can, and had spent the following morning's fence conversation studiously avoiding any mention of the incident, while her ears remained at a suspicious half-mast the entire time. He mentioned none of it directly. 2 failed relationships had taught him, if nothing else, the wisdom of not naming a thing before he understood what it was, of not frightening off whatever fragile creature might be circling closer, testing the air, deciding whether it was safe to land. So he simply watched, and catalogued, and let the pastries, when they came 2 days later, wrapped in cloth and still faintly warm, with a note reading only for you. Don't tell my sister I gave you the good batch. Joined the growing file of evidence he was building without yet permitting himself to name what the evidence was building toward. It was his neighbor Rosalind, Leora's younger cousin, a sharp-eyed rabbit girl of about 19 who worked the co-op stand on market mornings, who finally cracked the pattern open for him, entirely by accident, while he was buying eggs. "Oh, the pastries," Rosalind said when he mentioned, with what he thought was admirable casualness, that Liora had shared some baking with him. "Yeah, she wouldn't let any of us near that batch. Guarded the cooling rack like a hawk all afternoon. Auntie Ferris tried to sneak one and Liora practically hissed at her." Rosalind laughed, counting out his change. "First time I've ever seen her do that. She usually gives half her baking away before it's even cooled." Evan stood very still, holding his carton of eggs, doing the kind of quiet mental recalculation an engineer does when a reading comes back that contradicts every assumption the model was built on. Rejected by her relatives, the story had gone. Not guarded from them. He walked home slowly that morning, the eggs forgotten under one arm, turning the new information over and over, and for the first time allowed himself to actually look at the pattern instead of simply enjoying its results. Carrots she'd had extra of. Soup she needed a guinea pig for. Bread that had, accidentally, come out enormous. Roasted vegetables threatening to spoil on the wrong day of the week entirely. Pastries she'd guarded rather than been forced to give away. Every single excuse, examined honestly, had the shape of something built after the fact, a reason constructed to explain a gift that hadn't actually needed explaining, except that the giving itself was the part that needed covering. Not the food. The reason for the food. He thought about the ears standing straight up. The foot thumping against the porch swing cushion. The nose that fluttered like a small nervous engine every time he said something kind about her cooking. He did not yet let himself think the word that was starting to hover at the edge of the thought. But he noticed, with the same quiet attentiveness he brought to a malfunctioning pressure valve, that something in the system had shifted, and that he had been too slow. Or too unwilling to see it. The escalation, when it came, arrived all at once. He came home from a punishing double shift, a coolant leak in the southern spire that had taken most of the day and half the evening to trace and seal, bone-tired, half-blind with fatigue, thinking of nothing beyond the shower he intended to take and the bed he intended to collapse into. He turned up his own lane in the deep blue dusk and stopped dead at the sight of his porch. A table. An actual table, small and round, draped in a cloth the color of ripe wheat, set with 2 plates and 2 glasses and a scatter of tea lights and little glass jars that flickered gold against the coming dark. A covered dish sat in the center, steam still curling faintly from beneath the lid, and beside it a small vase held 3 stems of some pale flower he didn't recognize. Evan stood at the edge of his own porch steps for a long moment, exhaustion forgotten, staring at the arrangement with something that was no longer simple confusion. The door of the honey-colored house 2 doors down opened, and Liora stepped out onto her own porch, saw him standing there, and went absolutely still, ears rigid, tail flat against the back of her dress, the picture of a woman caught in the act of something she hadn't planned to be caught at. You're early," she said. "I mean late. I didn't expect you back until later. I was going to be gone before." "Liora." He said her name carefully, the way he might approach a piece of equipment he suspected was about to do something he hadn't accounted for. "This is a lot of candles for leftovers." Her ears flattened, just slightly, and her foot, he could hear it now, a rapid soft thump against her own porch boards, gave her away entirely. "It's the co-op had a sale on the candles. I bought too many. Seemed wasteful not to use them." Her nose was fluttering so fast it was almost a blur. "You should eat before it gets cold." It's nothing. I'll leave you to it." She turned to go back inside, moving with the particular speed of someone fleeing a conversation rather than simply ending it, and Evan, too tired to filter the thought before it left his mouth, too tired to do anything but say the true thing, called after her. "Liora, wait." She stopped on her own top step, back to him, ears still rigid, and didn't turn around. "I'm not going to pretend I don't see what's happening," he said quietly into the space between their 2 porches. "I just don't know what it is. And I don't want to guess wrong and make this weird, if it's not what I think it might be. So I'd rather ask?" For a long moment she said nothing at all, and the only sound in the whole darkening lane was the soft mechanical whir of an irrigation timer clicking on somewhere down the row, and the rapid, unmistakable thump of her foot against the boards. "It's just carrots," she said finally, very quietly, and went inside, and shut the door. Evan stood alone on his porch, in front of a candlelit table set for 2, and understood, with the slow, certain click of a diagnosis finally confirmed, that it had never, not once, been just carrots. He ate dinner alone that night anyway, because he didn't know what else to do, and it was, again, extraordinary, and he hated a little that even now, confused and unsettled as he was, some part of him simply enjoyed the meal for what it was. He left one of the little tea lights burning on his windowsill after he cleared the table, for reasons he didn't examine, and went to bed thinking about a foot thumping against porch boards until well past midnight. For 3 days after the candlelit table, either of them mentioned it, and the food, for the first time since the carrots had appeared, stopped coming. Evan told himself this was for the best. He told himself, lying awake those 3 nights turning the whole strange autumn over in his mind, that he had pushed too hard by simply naming what he noticed, that some things, like startled animals, like fragile machinery under too much pressure, needed to be approached slowly or not at all, and that his blunt engineer's habit of naming a problem the moment he diagnosed it had, this time, cost him something he hadn't fully understood he wanted until it went quiet. He caught himself, on the second evening, sitting near his own door with the lights off, listening for footsteps that didn't come, and felt, with a fresh and unwelcome clarity, exactly how much he had already come to depend on a sound he'd had no right to expect in the first place. He saw Liora only once during those 3 days, from a distance, crossing her own garden with a basket of cut herbs, her ears low, her pace quicker than usual, clearly arranging her route to avoid the fence line where they usually spoke. He didn't call out to her. He told himself it was respect for whatever boundaries she was drawing. He suspected uncomfortably that it was also simple cowardice. The old familiar instinct to let a good thing recede quietly rather than risk reaching for it and being told, again, that he was too much work to reach. It was old Tobias, of all people, who broke the silence, ambling over to Evan's fence on the 3rd evening with a bag of his prized tomatoes and an expression of studied neutrality that fooled absolutely no one. "You two have a fight?" the old man asked, without preamble. "We didn't have a fight," Evan said. "I don't think." "I'm honestly not entirely sure what happened," Tobias grunted, setting his tomatoes on the fence post with the air of a man settling in for a longer conversation than either of them had planned. "Fenwick girl's been feeding you since midsummer," he said. Whole Lane's noticed. Whole Lane's been waiting to see how long it'd take you to notice back. He fixed Evan with a look that was not unkind, but was entirely without patience for further foolishness. "She's not a woman who does things halfway, son. Never has been. Whatever you said or didn't say, fix it. Don't let a good thing go quiet just because you're more comfortable with quiet than most." He left the tomatoes and ambled off without waiting for a response, and Evan stood at his fence for a long time afterward, tomatoes forgotten in his hands, turning Tobias's words over with the same careful attention he'd give a diagnostic readout he didn't yet trust himself to interpret correctly. Don't let a good thing go quiet. He thought of 2 years of eating standing at his counter. He thought of a foot thumping against porch boards. He thought, with sudden and total clarity, that he was done being careful in the way that had cost him every good thing he'd ever half reached for. The opportunity to do something about it, rather than simply think about it, arrived the very next afternoon. He didn't bring it up directly. He wasn't built for bringing things up. That had been established, thoroughly, by 2 prior relationships and 34 years of practice. But he was, at least, no longer content to let the silence stand unchallenged, and Liora, for her part, seemed to have retreated a step even as some cautious, hopeful part of her kept the garden gate unlatched. The opportunity to close the distance between them arrived on a blustery afternoon when he came home to find Liora standing in her garden in a heavy coat, staring at her greenhouse with an expression of pure frustrated defeat. "Everything all right?" he asked, over the fence. "Heater's dead," she said, not looking at him, arms crossed against the wind. "Whole unit. Cold snaps coming in 3 days and I've got 2 months of seedlings in there that won't survive it. I put in a request with the co-op's maintenance line but they're backed up until..." She checked her handheld. "Next week. Which is useless. I could look at it," Evan said before he'd fully decided to offer. She turned, ears lifting with visible hope before some more careful instinct pulled them back down. "You don't have to." "I want to," he said, and found, saying it, that it was entirely true. Not the reflexive offer of a neighbor returning a favor, but something he actually, specifically wanted, an excuse to be useful to her, to stand in her space and fix something that mattered to her, to give back some fraction of the warmth she'd been quietly pouring onto his porch for weeks, and to close, deliberately this time, the distance that 3 careful days had opened between them. You've been feeding me carrots for a month under increasingly implausible pretenses. Let me look at your heater. Her nose twitched, and something that might have been a laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Fine, she said. Fine. Come look at the terrible heater. The greenhouse was a narrow glass structure behind her house, warm and green-smelling even with its heater dead. Rows of seedling trays lined up under grow lamps that flickered with the same failing power draw that had killed the heater. Evan spent the better part of an hour with his head inside the unit's housing, tracing a corroded relay back to its source while Liora hovered nearby, alternately handing him tools and telling him, unprompted, the entire life history of every plant in the greenhouse, which ones were finicky, which ones her grandmother had first cultivated, which strain of tomato had taken her 3 years to get right. He liked listening to her talk. He liked it more than he was prepared to admit, the easy tumble of her sentences, the way her hands moved when she got excited about a particular variety of squash, the small satisfied sound she made when he finally got the relay swapped and the heater kicked back on with a low, healthy hum. It was while she was distracted, checking the temperature gauge with obvious relief, that he noticed the book. It sat on a low shelf near the potting bench, half tucked behind a stack of seed catalogs. A thick, handmade cookbook, its cover soft leather, clearly years old and much used. He wouldn't have looked twice at it, except that a corner of paper stuck out from between its pages, and on that corner, in the same careful looping handwriting he now recognized instantly, were the words, "Evan likes this one." He shouldn't have opened it. He knew that, even as his hand reached for it, the way you know a circuit is live before you touch it, and touch it anyway because you have to know for certain. He opened it to the marked page. A recipe for the carrot soup, and beside it, in the margin, a note, "Try less spice next time, he seemed to prefer it milder." Another page, further in, a bread recipe, annotated good with the pastries, maybe both together for the harvest social. And further still, entire pages of recipes he didn't recognize, dishes he'd never been given, planned out in loving, obsessive detail, dates penciled beside some of them, a whole autumn's worth of meals mapped out and waiting. Evan! He looked up. Liora stood frozen by the potting bench, the temperature gauge forgotten in her hand, her ears flat against her skull, her whole body gone rigid with a mortification so complete it was almost physical to witness. "I can explain," she said, and her voice cracked slightly in the middle of it. "I can, that's not, please put that down." He closed the book gently and set it back on the shelf, and crossed the small space between them, and did not laugh, because there was nothing in him that found this funny. There was only something in him, finally, breaking open. "I'm not going to laugh at you," he said quietly. "I want you to know that first, before anything else. I'm not going to laugh." Leora's eyes were bright and overfull, her ears still pinned flat, her arms wrapped around herself as though she could physically hold the embarrassment in. "You must think I don't even know. Pathetic. Obsessive. Evan, I have weeks of meals planned in that book. I've been planning what to feed you since midsummer. That's not normal." "That's not something a person does for a neighbor." "No," he agreed gently. "It isn't." She flinched, and he realized how that had landed, and reached out, carefully, the way he'd reach for a piece of fragile equipment, to touch her arm. "I didn't mean it as a bad thing," he said. "I meant, you're right. It isn't something a person does for just a neighbor. I've known that for a while now, Liora. I think I've known it since the bread that was accidentally enormous. I just didn't know what to do with knowing it, because you kept telling me it was nothing, and I didn't want to be the person who pushed past what you were comfortable telling me. And then I named it too bluntly anyway, out on the porch, and you went quiet on me for 3 days, and I nearly let that quiet win. Tobias had to practically shake me by the collar to remind me not to." That surprised a small, wet laugh out of her. "Tobias talked to you?" "Delivered tomatoes and a lecture in the same visit," Evan said. "Very efficient man." Her ears lifted, slowly, uncertainly, tracking his face. "You knew? All this time? I'm an engineer," he said. I notice patterns. Carrots you had extra of. Soup that needed a guinea pig. Bread that came out enormous by accident. Roasted vegetables that spoiled 3 days before your actual delivery day, which I happen to know because I fix your co-op's refrigeration unit twice a year. Pastries you guarded from your own family so hard your cousin thought you'd hissed at your aunt. He watched her wince at that, filed away for later confirmation that Rosalind had indeed talked. None of those excuses held up on their own. All of them together told a story you weren't ready to tell me directly. I just didn't know what the story meant. I know what it means where I'm from, roughly. I didn't know if it meant the same thing to you. She was quiet for a long moment, her hands twisting together in front of her, foot beginning its familiar rapid thump against the greenhouse's stone floor. Among my people, she said finally, very softly. Feeding someone, really feeding them, from your own garden, your own hands, without them asking, it's not just kindness. It's a courtship. An old one. Older than most of the newer customs people actually use anymore, but my grandmother taught it to me and I never had reason to use it before. Her ears drooped, just slightly. You're not leporine. I told myself you couldn't possibly know what it meant, which meant I could do it without ever actually telling you how I felt. I could just feed you. And if you never understood, I never had to survive you turning me down. I could just keep bringing you carrots forever and call it kindness and never risk anything at all. Evan felt something in his chest crack quietly open, some old careful architecture he'd built to keep himself safe from exactly this kind of exposure, watching it happen to someone else instead. That sounds lonely, he said. Loving someone that carefully, for that long, and never letting them know. It was, Liora admitted, and her voice broke properly this time, one tear escaping before she scrubbed it away with the back of her wrist, laughing wetly at herself. It was so lonely, Evan. You have no idea. I might have some idea, he said, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in years. I wait for you, he said, because if she was going to stand in her greenhouse and hand him the truth with both hands shaking, he owed her the same. Most evenings, I get home from a shift, and I sit near the door instead of going straight to the shower or making dinner, because some part of me is listening for your footsteps on the porch. I've been doing it for weeks and I only just admitted it to myself, standing here, right now. Leora's ears came fully upright, disbelief and hope warring openly across her face. You wait for me? I look forward to your food more than I've looked forward to almost anything in 2 years, he said. But it's not really the food, Liora. I mean, the food is extraordinary, I'm not going to pretend it isn't. But it's you. It's the note on the bundle of carrots. It's the way your ears do that thing when I compliment your cooking. It's listening to you talk about your grandmother's tomatoes for 45 minutes while I fixed your heater, and realizing I could have listened for another 45 and been perfectly happy. He paused, and made himself say the rest of it, the part that had always been the hardest part for him with anyone. I'm not easy to be close to. I know that about myself. I go quiet for days sometimes and I don't always know how to ask for what I need, and the last 2 people who tried to get close to me both eventually gave up and told me I was hard to reach. I don't want you to think this is going to be simple, if it's something you actually want. But I want to try. I want to try with you specifically, more than I've wanted to try with anyone in a very long time. Liora looked at him for a long moment, eyes still bright, and then she laughed. A small, startled, overjoyed sound, and closed the last of the distance between them. You noticed my ears, she said. You've been cataloging my ears. I've been cataloging a lot of things about you, he admitted, and felt his own face go warm. I'm an engineer. It's a compulsion. Well, she said, and her foot was thumping so fast now it was practically a blur against the stone floor, betraying the calm she was visibly trying to hold onto in her voice. For the record, the pastries. I did guard them from my aunt. On purpose. I wanted every single one to go to you. I gathered that, eventually, he said, and found himself smiling in a way his own face wasn't used to. Rosalind is a terrible secret keeper. Rosalind, Liora said with real feeling, is going to hear about this. They walked back to his house together in the last of the light, her ears loose and easy now, her hand finding his somewhere along the short distance between the greenhouse and his lane, and neither of them commented on it, though he was fairly sure they were both aware of very little else. The candlelit table was still there, cleared from that first night, but he hadn't taken it down, some part of him unwilling to dismantle the evidence of what she'd built for him even before either of them had said a true word about it. He'd left it standing on his porch, folded cloth and empty tea light jars and all, a monument to weeks of careful, silent devotion. He stopped in front of it and turned to her. "I have a question," he said, "and I think I already know the answer, but I'd like to hear you say it anyway." Her ears lifted, curious, hopeful. "Ask." He gestured at the table, the candles, the two plates, the whole quiet architecture of everything she'd been too afraid to say out loud. "Would you like to stop leaving dinner at my door," he said, "and start eating it with me instead?" For a moment she didn't answer at all. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, a woman visibly trying to construct something composed and dignified. And then her foot, betraying her completely, began to thump so hard and so fast against the porch boards that the empty glasses on the table actually rattled, a small chorus of clinking crystal underscoring the silence where her answer should have been. "Liora," he said, laughing now, genuinely, in a way he hadn't laughed in longer than he wanted to think about. "I'm going to take that as a yes." "Yes," she managed, laughing and crying at once, ears straight up, tail betraying its own small frantic wag beneath her coat. "Yes, obviously yes, I have been trying to say yes since the carrots, Evan, I have been trying to say yes for 2 months. He kissed her before she could finish the sentence, there on his porch, beside a table she'd set for two out of love she hadn't dared to name, candlelight long since burned down to nothing but the memory of it, and Liora Fenwick. Foot still thumping, ears still upright, nose fluttering fast enough to blur, kissed him back like a woman finally allowed to stop pretending. Meridian Hollow, as established, was the kind of colony where everyone knew everyone's business before breakfast, and so it took approximately 4 days for the entire lane to know that Evan Mercer and Liora Fenwick were courting. Not that either of them had made any particular announcement, but Rosalind had seen them walking hand in hand to the market on Saturday morning, and Rosalind, as previously noted, was a terrible secret keeper. Old Tobias offered Evan unsolicited tomato-growing advice with the air of a man imparting a sacred trust, on the theory that a man courting a Fenwick ought to at least attempt to keep a respectable garden. The attempt, over the following weeks, produced a small and lopsided but genuinely alive row of carrots, which Evan tended with the same dogged attentiveness he brought to a malfunctioning atmospheric processor, and which Liora declared, with visible and completely sincere delight, the ugliest and best carrots she had ever seen in her life. The dinners continued, but differently now. Not left at his door with a fabricated excuse and a hasty retreat, but eaten together, most evenings, at the little table on his porch or hers, trading off, her cooking and his increasingly competent attempts to reciprocate, which ranged from adequate to genuinely alarming depending on how closely he'd followed her handwritten instructions. She laughed at his failures without cruelty and celebrated his successes like small miracles, and Evan discovered, somewhere in the middle of that autumn, that he had stopped eating standing up at his kitchen counter entirely. He couldn't remember exactly when it had happened. He only noticed, one evening, that the idea of eating alone again had become strange to him, foreign, a habit belonging to some earlier and lonelier version of himself. He told her, eventually, about the 2 relationships that had come before her, about being told he was hard to reach, about the particular quiet architecture he'd built around himself to keep from being disappointed again. She listened without trying to fix it, without telling him he was wrong about himself, and then said simply, "I like the parts of you that go quiet. I don't need you to perform being easy. I just need you to let me stay, even when you're quiet. That's all courting ever meant, where I'm from. Not making noise at each other. Just staying." He thought about that for a long time afterward, and found it was the truest thing anyone had ever said to him about what he needed. Her cookbook, the one he'd stumbled onto in the greenhouse, full of dishes planned and dated for a future she hadn't dared believe in, got a new section that winter, added in his own careful, unpracticed handwriting beside hers. Notes on which of his own attempts had actually turned out edible, small annotations in the margins where she'd corrected his technique. Liora says less salt. This one made her laugh so hard she cried, worth repeating. Ask her about her grandmother's version. She gets a specific look when she talks about it. I want to see it again. The book, which had once been a private, secret map of longing too frightening to speak aloud, slowly became something else entirely. A shared record of two people learning, meal by meal, how to stay. The harvest social came in late autumn. The whole colony gathered under strings of lantern light in the community orchard, long tables groaning under the weight of every household's best dish, children weaving between the adults' legs in packs, someone's cousin playing an old fiddle badly and enthusiastically in the corner. Liora brought the carrot soup, properly seasoned now, the recipe long since perfected through a full season of testing on one particular guinea pig. And it disappeared from its pot within the first 20 minutes, praised up and down the tables by half the colony. She stood beside Evan while people complimented it, her ears high with quiet pride, and when old Tobias asked, with theatrical innocence, whether this was the same soup recipe she'd apparently been testing for months, half the table burst into knowing laughter, and Liora went the particular shade of pink that meant her ears would be standing at full attention for the rest of the evening. Everyone knew, Evan said, leaning close to her ear, delighted. The whole colony knew before I did. The whole colony, she said, mortified and laughing at once, has been waiting for you to catch up for 2 months. Rosalind had a running wager going at the co-op stand. Did she win? She lost, Liora said. She bet you'd need until the first snow. My Aunt Ferris bet you'd figure it out at the greenhouse. Ferris won 40 credits. Evan laughed, a full, easy laugh, the kind he hadn't produced with any regularity in years. And found, looking around the lantern-lit orchard at the whole warm, nosy, deeply invested colony that had apparently been rooting for him from a distance the entire time, that the particular ache of not belonging that had followed him for 2 years had gone strangely, thoroughly quiet. He didn't feel like the quiet engineer at the end of the lane anymore. He felt, for the first time since he'd arrived on Bellwether, like a person other people had been waiting to welcome all along. He had simply needed someone patient enough, and brave enough, to bring him in from the cold one careful bundle of carrots at a time. Later that night, walking her home under a sky gone thick with stars, Leora's grandmother caught them at the orchard gate, and looked at the two of them, Evan's hand loose around Leora's, both of them still faintly pink from an evening of good-natured teasing, with an expression of deep, unsurprised satisfaction. "Took you long enough," the old woman said to Evan, not unkindly, and patted his arm with a papery hand. "She gets that stubbornness from her grandfather's side. Wonderful man. Terrible at asking for anything directly. You'll have to learn to read what she doesn't say, same as I did with him." She turned to go, then paused, glancing back over her shoulder with a small, knowing smile. For what it's worth, the carrots were her grandfather's favorite trick too. Never once told me what they meant. I had to figure it out myself, same as you. She winked, and disappeared into the dark toward her guest room in Leora's house, leaving the two of them laughing quietly together at the gate. Winter came to Bellwether the way it always did, not harshly, thanks to the terraforming spires that kept the moon's weather gentler than nature ever intended, but with a hush all the same, frost silvering the garden rows and the light going pale and low across the valley. The greenhouse held, thanks to a heater that never failed again under Evan's watchful maintenance, and the two of them spent long winter evenings inside it, Liora tending seedlings for the spring planting while Evan tinkered with the irrigation timers and, increasingly, simply sat on the old stool by the potting bench watching her work, content in a way he was still relearning how to name. They moved between houses easily by then, without much discussion of it. Dinner some nights at his table, some nights at hers, the cookbook migrating back and forth between kitchens along with a slowly accumulating collection of shared objects that neither of them commented on directly. A spare toothbrush, a jacket left behind and never quite reclaimed, a second key cut without either of them making a formal announcement of what it meant. Evan noticed that winter that he had stopped counting the days between her visits, because there stopped being meaningful gaps to count. He noticed that his own garden, the lopsided, dogged little row of carrots he'd started under Tobias's tutelage, had, against all odds, produced an actual harvest, small and stubborn and slightly misshapen, and that presenting the first of it to Liora on a cold evening in deep winter, wrapped clumsily in twine because he'd seen her do it, and had no better model to follow, had made her laugh so hard she'd had to sit down on the porch steps to recover, ears bouncing, tail wagging visibly beneath her coat. "You're doing it back to me," she said, wiping her eyes, holding the crooked little bundle like it was something precious, which, by then, it was. "You absolute engineer. You've turned my grandmother's oldest courting custom into a system. I noticed a pattern that worked," Evan said, entirely unrepentant, "and I replicated it. That is the least romantic possible description of what you just did. I grew you carrots, Liora." "You grew me," she said, still laughing, pulling him down to sit beside her on the cold steps. "The ugliest, most crooked, most perfect carrots I have ever seen in my life." And kissed him there in the winter dusk, ears warm against his cold cheek, foot, he could feel it even through her boot, pressed against the step, thumping softly, happily, entirely without her permission, the way it always did when she stopped trying to hide exactly how she felt. The single carrot sat on the doormat, small and slightly dirt-flecked, resting there with none of the ceremony of the bundles and dishes and candlelit tables that had come before it. Evan looked at it for a long moment, standing in his own doorway in the early evening light, genuinely puzzled. 1 carrot. No note. No twine. It was such a strange, spare little offering after weeks of increasingly elaborate meals that he actually crouched down to inspect it more closely, wondering if he'd missed a note tucked somewhere beneath it, some new implausible excuse waiting to be discovered. "Looking for something?" He looked up. Liora stood in his own doorway behind him. Inside his own house, he registered belatedly, having apparently let herself in sometime in the last hour with the spare key he'd given her 3 weeks earlier, wearing an apron dusted with flour, her ears relaxed and easy, a soft, satisfied smile on her face that he'd come to recognize as the particular expression she wore when she'd successfully surprised him. "There's a carrot on my doormat," he said, straightening up, holding it out to her as evidence. 1 carrot. No note. No excuse about your garden having extra. I don't know what to make of it." Her smile widened. "That's because I've officially decided," she said, "that I'm done leaving dinner at your door." He looked past her, into his own kitchen, and saw, through the doorway, warm light spilling out into the hall. The table set, 2 places, steam rising gently from a dish he couldn't yet identify by smell, a scatter of candles already lit, the whole quiet architecture of everything she used to leave outside now standing squarely inside the home they were, more and more each week, simply beginning to share. "Dinner's already waiting," Liora said, taking the single carrot from his hand and tossing it lightly, affectionately, back toward the little garden he'd been so proudly, so badly cultivating along the side of his porch. "At the table. Where I intended to stay, every night, for as long as you'll have me." Evan Mercer, quiet engineer, hard to reach, a man who had once believed himself built for solitude, followed her inside, closed the door on the cooling evening air, and sat down at his own table, across from the woman who had spent an entire season teaching him, one implausible excuse at a time, exactly how to stay. Dinner, he thought, watching her ladle soup into his bowl with the same careful attention she'd once poured into pastries she guarded from her own family, had never once been the point. It had only ever been carrots. And carrots, it turned out, had only ever been love, waiting patiently on the doormat for him to finally understand what he was looking at.